lovely people, I'm back with another long-form video. I haven't gotten to this for multiple weeks, but that's mostly because I've been pretty busy and now I finally have some free time to go ahead and make it, so here we are. Today we're going to be talking about Robert E. Lee, the Confederate General of the South. Now generally when I make long-form videos, I make it so I can spend more time talking about a person. I made that pretty clear as I've ended up talking quite a bit about the successes and going into the life stories of great American heroes. But the reason this is a long-form video is because it needs some nuance. There's quite a few things to say, and I can't exactly say it all in a minute, so here we go. And with that said, a lot of you are probably thinking, why did you choose Robert E. Lee for an America 250 video? I mean, he was like in charge of the Confederate Army. He was one of the biggest pieces of opposition to the United States in United States history. Why him? Well, because he's part of the country's history. Not only part of the country's history, but one of the most interesting and possibly, dare I say, greatest men who's ever been an American. Not great as in his cause should be taken up, but great as in the things he achieved were genuinely insane. So I want to look at a few different things about Robert E. Lee, beginning with his moral conflict about joining the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee was actually a very strong Unionist. You might not think this at first, considering he fought the Union, but remember, he fought for the Union in the Mexican-American War, and he was married to the Custis family, the family line of George Washington's wife. When it came time to secede, he was actually quite fairly against it. It actually caused him quite a great deal of internal turmoil. He was very loyal to his home state, but also he'd spent his entire life up to that point working for the Union. To quote him, he said, "Mr. Blair, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 millions of slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state?" Now, that quote needs a little bit of context. Mr. Blair was one of Abraham Lincoln's top advisors, and when he says sacrifice the slaves to the North, he means give up the slaves. It's Old English talk. If he meant it in that speech figuratively the way we'd use it today, I would be making no argument. Now anyways, returning to the talk about moral conflict, the South had a good deal of Union generals that defected. But as sides were being chosen, a few of Lee's friends were serving in the North. And this furthered his mental turmoil about whether he should follow his seceded state or not. Openly, he decided that he was first and foremost a resident of his state. Although it was not an easy decision to make, he was not fond of the war. He was really quite against it. Another quote of his, he said, "I see a terrible war coming. These young men who have never seen war cannot wait for it to happen. But I tell you, I wish I owned every slave in the South, for I would free them all to avoid this war." Now, Virginia ended up seceding, and he went with his state, as he promised he would as tensions were rising. But it was not a decision he made lightly. He was openly willing to fight for the Union as well if Virginia went with the Union. But he didn't, because back in those days, you saw yourself first and foremost as a resident of your state, and Lee was no different. Any other general in his shoes likely would have done the same thing. That shows you a little bit of the weight of his actions, that he wasn't ready to jump on the Union and destroy the United States. That he would free every slave in the South to prevent the war. Now, this isn't to praise Lee or say he was some awesome human being, but I want to clear that out of the way to say that he wasn't a terrible human. And that leads right into my next point. People will say, but he was a slave owner. He was a Southerner. He was a slave owner, but he actually freed all his slaves in 1862. Some of those slaves were freed by mandate, by will of one of his relatives, but after he freed them, he freed the rest. This is before the Civil War was lost, people. This is at the height of the Civil War. This is in 1862 he did this. Now, if these things will make him a slightly more better person in your eyes, or at least a more morally conflicted person in your eyes, then I really don't know what will. Since I was talking about Lee, I figured I might as well get my take out of the way and maybe push back on a little bit of what's being taught nowadays, that he was this evil person who just jumped on the chance to destroy the Union because, well, he was evil and he loved slavery. When a lot of his quotes and, well, his actions prove relatively the opposite. Now, what I'm not saying is that I'm a pro-Confederate. If the South ever seceded again, I would be very strongly against seceding with it. All I'm really saying is he was a lot more of a morally conflicted person than you probably initially thought. Not saying he was the good guy necessarily, but can we stop dumping on him quite as much? Because he's not as evil as he's made out to be. Moving on to the next part of his life that I just want to touch on really fast, his early life. So he was born the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, who was a Revolutionary War hero, also known as Henry Lee III. Now, Henry was not what you'd call rich. He had fallen into massive debt, and he escaped to the West Indies to try and escape his debtors. This succeeded, but he died before he could return back to the United States in 1818, leaving Lee the primary caretaker of his family. Robert E. Lee received a basic classical education at Alexandria Academy. He would later transfer over to West Point, where he would meet a good deal of his associates and opponents that he would face during the Civil War. He was top of his class at West Point, a very genius military mind, and that would show as the Civil War would come in about 40 years. And then came the year 1829, where he had two major events: the beginning of his courtship with Mary Custis and the death of his mother. The death of his mother shook him pretty hard, and he described that time as a very bittersweet point in his life, as he was very sad about his mother, but he was quite happy with Mary Custis. Mary Custis was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, First Lady of the United States, George Washington's wife. It was through Mary Custis that General Lee would receive the Arlington House, which he gained upon inheritance. The Arlington House was a beautiful estate located in Washington, D.C., and it overlooked the capital city. During the Civil War, he was cheated out of it because it was such a strategic location that they couldn't have the enemy general so close to their capital city with such a great view. And also, I've been to the Arlington House. It's now Arlington Cemetery, and it's pretty beautiful. It feels so strange over there. It's like this weird surreal, but also somberness that you get just from the rows of graves and stuff. This is beside the point of Lee, but it's actually pretty interesting over there. It's a pretty interesting feeling you feel when you're over there. You feel just whatever. Yeah, so that's where Arlington Cemetery comes from. He continued to serve in the Army, where he was called to the Mexican-American War in 1846. He proved his valor and was sent on reconnaissance missions into Mexico City, and it was in this war that him and a lot of other Southern generals got their start. And then came the Civil War, which is where things really started to ramp up. I already mentioned earlier in the video that he was not extremely jumpy at the chance to leave the Union and fight for the South, but out of allegiance to his state, he did so, and he became the Confederate general. Now, Lee's feats of military might were quite incredible. What a lot of people forget about the Civil War was that the North was industrialized in every sense of the word. It should have won, and well, ultimately it did. But the reason it was able to hold off for so long has to do with the fact that Lee was an incredible general who knew how to lead his troops well and was called one of the greatest military minds in history by Winston Churchill, another pretty good military mind. He consistently outthought his enemies, but ultimately he was the one who was played as he was captured at the Appomattox Courthouse and forced to surrender. And I mentioned before, I've seen the seats that they sat in at the Appomattox Courthouse. They had them in one of the Smithsonian museums. I can't remember what the exact name of it is, but it's the one where the Star-Spangled Banner is also there. Man, I'm not going to stop bragging about my DC trip. But in any case, Lee surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse, ending the Civil War. Following the Civil War, his life took different turns. He, along with other Confederate figureheads, was revoked of citizenship and tried for treason. In Lee's case specifically, I'm kind of unclear as to whether he was convicted or not. I think he was, but he didn't face any severe punishments for it. He served as president of the Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, until he died, or roughly about that point. A national hero who was regarded up until recently as a great American figure, and he still helped the South rebuild as much as he could, remaining loyal to his state, which was once again part of the Union. I'm going to go real fast back to the Civil War, and another factor that helped the South stay on for so long. So going back to the 1840s, there was rumors of a civil war, and President Buchanan had an idea. He moved a lot of the North's military technology into the South, so that when the Civil War came, the South would be armed. So Lee's brilliant tactics were a major player, but President Buchanan's contribution was also pretty important to the South holding on for 4 years. And yeah, that's what I got to say. So if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and maybe share this video to someone you think would probably like it. And I'll see you in the next one where I talk about Lee's direct opposition, General Ulysses S. Grant. And remember, another day, another story.